This video is brought to you by Pilutics. In May 1945, German villagers stood shivering on the banks of the river. Allied soldiers made them watch as 60 emaciated prisoners shuffled past. These Germans were forced spectators at their own history. They were watching the last remnants of the Nuremberg Death March shuffle past, many too weak to do anything but collapse onto the bank and die. The Allies wanted these Germans to see the fruits of their neighbors' fanaticism, to make them confront the physical embodiment of the horrors the Nazis had inflicted upon Europe. This was intentional psychological warfare. You could call it collective guilt. The Allied plan was to hammer home the idea that all Germans had been responsible for what their leaders did. All Germans were tainted. And so, when the Americans, British, French, and Soviets split up post-war Germany and started trying to figure out what to do with it, they hatched an ambitious plan to literally remove Nazism from the German people. They called it Denazification. And this is how it went down. First, a little housekeeping. What exactly was Denazification? Well, basically the Allied strategy to denazify Germany. In reality, it played out very differently across the 4 occupied zones. But before we get there, let's start at the beginning. In February 1945, the Allies met up at a place called Yalta to discuss the future of Europe. Specifically, they discussed how to handle defeated Germany. There, they agreed to remove all Nazi Party members from positions of power in public and private life. So when the war ended, they just started arresting everyone who belonged to the Nazi Party. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, the problem was that besides the 8.5 million people who belonged to the Nazi Party, there were another 45 million people in organizations closely affiliated with the Nazis. That's like half the population of Germany. And then there were the millions more who'd done one small thing or another to help out the regime. So the mass arrests quickly overwhelmed whatever system the occupiers put in place. Take the American zone, for example. By early 1946, they'd only managed to round up about 10% of the people they wanted. Still, even if the Allied powers hadn't managed to catch them all, they had a secret weapon: the ban on Nazi symbols. Overnight, swastikas became illegal. People couldn't display them or even wear clothing with them. If you wanted to get a job, you'd have to sign an affidavit swearing that you'd never been a member of the Nazi Party and that you hated Nazis. Yeah, it's almost like those woke diversity hires today. Now, while they hunted Nazis, the United States took control of German media. They shut down Nazi newspapers and radio stations and replaced them with pro-democracy material. It was like a mission from God, except, ironically, it also included book bans and the burning of books. Kind of like the Nazis did. In fact, the US military government in Germany compiled a list of 332 writers considered ideologically undesirable, and their works were removed from German libraries. They even shut down Charlie Chaplin's films because he was a known communist sympathizer. But the US wasn't alone. France banned anti-Semitic and pornographic books. Britain banned books that undermined the authority of the monarchy or glorified war. And Italy banned a lot of stuff, including books with nudity and political pamphlets. Everyone was playing the same game. By November 1945, the US had classified 183,000 Germans as Nazi Party members and had banned them from working in any of the following: civil service, journalism, education, transportation, banking, retail, or industry. So far, this was all relatively easy, mostly because no one really cared about any of those people. What was harder was actually holding Nazis accountable. That's why the Americans were glad they had the Nuremberg Trials. On November 1945, the world watched as 24 top-ranking Nazis entered a courtroom in Nuremberg. Among them were Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joseph Goebbels. For the next 8 months, prosecutors from the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union presented evidence of the horrific things these men had done. They told stories of slave labor, of gas chambers and death marches, of men and women reduced to numbers tattooed onto their forearms. But as horrible as the trials were, even they fell short. Here's why. The whole time the prosecution kept saying, "You are not here for your crimes against humanity. You are here for crimes against the Allied powers." It didn't matter that what they were accused of doing to Jews or Roma or gay people was illegal. It had to be illegal in Germany to get a conviction. Basically, they weren't tried for being evil. Still, the tribunal recognized that there were millions more Nazis besides the bigwig. And in October 1946, they issued something called Directive 24. This set up 5 categories of guilt for Germans: exonerated, nicht begangen, which means not guilty, Belasteter, Mittelsmann, and Haderer, and finally, major offender, which meant you were eligible for execution. Now that they had a system, the Allied powers could go back to hunting Nazis full-time. But the problem was that now they had to deal with the tens of millions of people who might be guilty of something. To deal with the overwhelming number of cases, each person got a questionnaire, a Fragebogen, which they filled out themselves and then submitted to their friends and neighbors for their approval. So here's how it worked. Let's say you were a Nazi party member. When the Americans came around asking questions, you handed over your Fragebogen, which you'd dutifully filled out with the help of your best friends and family. Your buddies would read through it and sign off on it, basically vouching for your character. And that was it. That's how you got your freedom. Of course, this led to widespread fraud. Friends and neighbors lied on the questionnaires, helping their friends keep their jobs and reputations. Only 1.4% of Germans were convicted as major offenders, though most of them were able to appeal. And by late 1946, 100,000 Germans had received their Purcell certificates, the nickname for whitewashing your reputation. So much for justice. The U.S. occupation ended in 1949. West Germany became a new and shiny democracy, and the Cold War was on. Suddenly, communism was the biggest threat, and Nazis seemed kind of old news. Sure, there were still a few diehards left in government and the military, but they were weeded out during the various rounds of denazification, right? Wrong. It turns out that some Nazis were more equal than others. Remember Operation Paperclip? The U.S. recruited Nazi scientists, including Wernher von Braun, who designed Germany's V-2 rocket, one of the first ballistic missiles. He and thousands of other scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the U.S. to kickstart America's space program. As the U.S. and Soviets drifted further apart, the Cold War grew. And in 1951, the German Federal Court ruled that communists were banned from holding political office. The court argued that since East Germany was communist, anyone loyal to the government there must be disloyal to West Germany. In 1952, the Bundestag passed a law which reinstated many former Nazis to public life. Now the goal was to bring stability to the country and prevent a communist takeover. So they needed the talented bureaucrats and administrators that the Nazis had put in place. They also needed to fill the government with conservatives who shared traditional German values. Basically, if you knew how to run a country and didn't belong to the Communist Party, you were good to go. In 1952, it became illegal to discriminate against someone based on their Nazi affiliations. 2 years later, the denazification process was officially over. So to answer our question from the beginning, did Germany get rid of the Nazis fast? Well, no. The process was chaotic and messy, and in the end, it was abandoned in favor of the Cold War. Germany was a battleground between superpowers, and in the end, what mattered most was keeping communists out, even if that meant letting Nazis in. Many thanks to my supporters who helped make this video possible. A special shout-out to Daniel, Stephen, Mark, and Ryan. And thank you all for watching. Subscribe for more historical tales.